Okay, so we have just finished up the first stage of our sculpting here with dynamic topology to get in our base forms for our character here. So the next step we're going to cover is how to do some retopology for characters. Now, this is largely going to be the same as doing retopology for our unique prop, mostly because this character is not going to require any facial animations. So normally when you are retopologizing a character that requires facial animations, you're going to want to pay special attention to the way that the loops form around your face in order to get a mesh that will deform correctly once these loops are animated. So a good example of this is something like this right here is a good guide for creating proper facial topology on a character whose face needs to deform through animation. So all I did was Google Retopology guide, and you'll get a lot of images like this that highlight the areas that you need to keep consistent edge loops in. So around the eyes needs to be a consistent edge loop in order to blink properly, around the mouth in order to speak properly, and then a larger one sort of around the chin and above the nose to get sort of facial expressions in. That is all very important to have if you are going to have facial animations on your character. Now, we are not going to do that, but nevertheless, we are still going to try to maintain a good, clean facial topology here as much as possible. So without further ado, let's get started on our retopology. So I always start my retopology process with a plane. So I'm going to move my 3D cursor up to the center of my head here because I want to start my retopology process with the face. It is the most complicated, and I think it is best just to get the hard stuff out of the way first. So the way I'm going to move my 3D cursor here is by holding Shift and right-clicking in my 3D viewport. That will snap the 3D cursor to my mesh wherever I click. Now, the purpose of doing that is that Blender will add your new mesh primitives at whatever location your 3D cursor is at. So normally, the 3D cursor is in the center of the world here. So any new mesh I add gets added right here at his feet. However, since I have moved my 3D cursor, now if I press Shift and A and add a plane, it will add it right where I placed it. So I'm going to rotate this plane by 90 degrees. In the X direction, and I'm going to scale it down. Okay, so once I have that roughly in place, the next thing I'm going to do is to turn on my surface snapping. So let's go ahead and turn on snapping up here and change it from increment to face. And we're also going to enable project individual elements. And then on my plane here, which let's just rename this retopology or something like that so we don't get confused. On my retopology plane here, I'm going to come into the modifiers and I'm going to add a shrink wrap modifier, and I'm going to select the character to be the surface I want to shrink wrap to. The next thing I'm going to do is come into my object data properties on my retopology plane, and I'm going to render everything as in front so I can see what I'm doing. And then I'm going to come into my viewport shading and turn on back face culling so that I don't see the back faces when I come around to do the back of the head here. Okay, just a few more things we really need to do here. I want to set up a mirror modifier with this retopology plane to do half the work essentially and keep my final low poly mesh symmetrical. So to do that, I'm just going to add a modifier mirror to the stack here on the retopology plane. X-axis is correct, and I want to enable clipping. So right now I have two duplicate planes sort of on top of each other because of the way that this is being mirrored. So I'm going to tab into edit mode. I'm going to grab the entire plane, and because I have clipping turned on, I can just hit G and X to grab it in the X until the center line here snaps to itself basically and clips to itself. And now I have a symmetrical retopology mesh to start from. Okay, so this video is mostly going to be demonstration. I've already covered sort of the basics of retopology in an earlier section, so if you need some review on retopology, go back and watch the video in the prompt creation section. Again, because the prop we made had a face, a lot of this is going to be review. But the process is going to be the same, and you know, retopology is somewhat a tedious process and a lot of people hate it. There are solutions for speeding this up and automating it. However, I'm not going to be covering those in this course because I have not found a good free solution for retopology so far. So, you know, in lieu of asking you to buy, you know, an $80 plugin that would speed up the process for me, it's just worthwhile, I think, just to show you how to do this process by hand. But just know that if you do find yourself really struggling with retopology, there are sort of automated or, you know, solutions that will at least speed it up, if not automate it completely. But it is good to know how to do it by hand in case, for whatever reason, you know, if you're working on a team that, you know, is not going to support the financing of one of those automated programs, or, you know, just for whatever reason has some special requirements. And sometimes the algorithms, as nice as they are to have, sometimes they do not work for very complex shapes. So it's nice to know how to do it by hand, if for no other reason than you understand what a sort of a plugin or an automated retopology remesher is doing. So all I've been doing here, I have my keystroke capture here in the corner, so you can follow along more easily. It's mostly just extruding out individual edges into new flat faces here to create my loops. I've created a loop around the mouth here, and I've started to come down into the nose, but I think actually to get a good topology on this, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create all my loops, my important loops first. So I've created one around the snout here. So to create another one around the eyes, I'm just going to highlight this single vertex. I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it. So it's still snapping to my mesh here, but I only have a single point in space. So what this allows me to do is create sort of a detached ring here. So I don't have to come off of an existing ring. I can just duplicate a single point and then hit E to extrude it out, and then select the edge that created and hit E to extrude that out for a face. So now I can create an independent loop going around the eyes and then worry about connecting them later. So I am taking some time, and I'm trying to get these quads as even as I possibly can. They are tapered somewhat inwards because of the nature of this loop, but I'm trying to just evenly distribute the edges that are going along this way as much as possible. So this edge, or this vert and this vert are lining up really nicely, so I'm just going to go ahead and fill these in right now. And I'm going to add one more edge loop with Control R right here so that these ones match up as well. And then I'm just going to redistribute these ones so that the divisions are a little bit more even with each other. Okay, so far so good. I want to create a loop around the mouth as well. So I'm going to do the same thing that I just did here for the eyes. I'm just going to pick a single point right here and Shift D to duplicate it. And I'm going to set it right in the mouth here on the line for the mouth, and then I'm going to press E to extrude it up. So because I'm coming from the center line here, I want to make sure that these snap together. So I'm actually going to move this one a little bit out in the X direction and then extrude it inwards so that it clips together like that and forms a single edge. So even though the mouth is closed because we were not going to be animating it, I still want to try to create a loop around here. So I'm going to have to start rotating these edges in order to make that turn. I'm just redistributing again here. And then same thing, and when I come around, I'm gonna roughly try to match the same number of polygons on either side. There we go. So normally for something with facial animations, I know I'm discussing this a lot for something we're not doing, but it's very common to create a character that needs to speak and blink and things. So I do want to talk about it even though I'm not going to be covering it in this. So normally this mouth would be open and you would have the entire interior mouth cavity, and you would just want to continue these loops down and retopologize the inside as well. But since I'm not going to be doing that, I'm just going to connect them right here. So I'm just going to create a fill line right here with the F key, and then we should be able to just repeatedly press F to fill in that entire loop right there. Okay, so this line and this line are matching up really nicely, so let's fill these in. Okay. You can also turn on random coloration if that helps. And then sometimes it says it's a random color, but really Blender is sampling from like a palette of colors. And occasionally you'll end up with two objects that happen to have the same color, even though they're supposed to be randomized. So my retopology plane here and the eyes here have been randomly assigned, and they happen to have been given the same color. So the way we can fix this is, I believe if we come in here and just rename one of them, it will re-randomize the color. And it does sometimes appear to be based off of the name. I'm not sure exactly how this algorithm works, but you'll find that if I have something like this and I go back to an older name, it's going to reassign that same color if I always have it this name, which is a little bit difficult to explain, but I think you can see what's happening here. I'm basically just trying to give this a different name until I get colors that are separate enough that I can really discern between them. Okay, so let's return to the retopology by coming back into edit mode. So I'm just going to come all the way around the back of the head to create sort of the basis for this. We can probably make these larger as we go around the back because the back of the head doesn't require as much topological detail. Okay, before we get too far around, let's come back to the face here. I want to I think I want to extend this loop all the way around here. So I'm just going to fill this in here. And then we'll probably need some sort of diamond or pole right here in order to split a loop going this way and one coming up. So I'm just going to worry about extending the loop for the moment. So when I'm extending a loop, you can either, a really quick way to extend a loop is to just select the outer edge and hit E to extrude the edge and then S to scale it up. Because of the snapping and the shrink wrapping I have on, you may need to come in and adjust these points so that they snap correctly, but you can see it's created this whole volume all the way around here very quickly. The other way to do it, of course, is with the F2 add-on that we talked about in a previous video, coming in and picking an interior corner and just hitting F to create that quad. So I've created a diamond right here. It's still a quad, but I need to come out this way and fill in this whole patch here eventually. So I want to be able to give myself enough geometry, enough room in order to do that. Another quick way to fill multiple loops is just to extend the loop out to the outer bounds of where you want it, like this, and then add the loops in this way. So as long as you have a closed loop, this is going to work. But since I have this connected, it's going to add a lot of geometry right here, which is not really what I want. But just be aware that is another quick way to extend your edge loops out. I'm going to merge these two together and maybe bring this down a little bit. We might need another loop right here. So we can fill right there like that. And then we want to follow this curve around. So I'm going to bring this point in this way because I want to be sure I'm matching the curvature of this brow here, and it sort of tapers in at the edge of the eye. So I'm just going to make sure I match that. And then we also need another edge running this way because we do not currently have enough geometry to match this curve here. So let's add another one with Control R, and we can grab this point and pull it out here. Also, if you find that because of our shrink wrap modifier, you're like losing your points underneath the mesh itself, if there's times like right here, for instance, where you cannot actually see the vertex, you can come up here and turn this on cage on and it will render that in front for you. So same thing up here, we need another loop right here to match the curvature of the brow, and right here. Let's try to shift these up a little bit by double tapping G, and that will slide the points along their respective edges. Okay, so we're already making pretty good progress here. We might want one more loop going this way just to really get that brow curve down. And then we're probably going to need a diamond shape right here. So let's extrude a point out. Let's fill this one in and then fill in the entire face. Okay, the head is going to be pretty straightforward, so I'm going to stay around these more complex forms for the time being and try to get some of the difficult bits out of the way. So let's form a curve sort of around this cheek here. So I'm going to come out, I think, just from here. And I'm just going to start extruding these edges out this way. And it's always a good idea to at least attempt to match your points because it makes connecting them a little bit easier. Oops. So now I have this quad I can fill in here. I might want to bring these back a little bit because this face, this diamond, is getting a little elongated and stretched. And in general, it's fine to have rectangular faces, of course, and even triangular faces in some cases, but you don't want to have like very odd shapes because you may get some shading issues. In general, the closer you can get to these being relatively even and square, the better your result is going to be, especially if you're taking this into high resolution sculpting afterwards, which we are, because you want to think about how meshes are subdivided in Blender. So subdivision works based on quadrilateral faces, such as these ones right here. So it's going to just divide them evenly. So you can imagine if you have, you know, one face that is maybe very small like that, and then one that is very long. When you go to subdivide it, they're not going to have equal levels of detail. Now, in some cases, that is exactly what you want. Like if you're trying to create a really tight crease for the mouth, for example, you actually do want more dense geometry in the crease of the mouth because it's going to form a tighter crease than if it was just these were connected directly to each other. But for areas that are supposed to be relatively uniform, you typically want your quads to be uniform as well. So I got a little sloppy right there, and I didn't match the edges here because I was just worried about getting this coverage. But I'm going to go in now and try to match these edges together so that I can easily connect these. So we need one more right here. And let's just start doing this right now. Let's fill this in. And fill this quad in. So we may need another edge loop right here as these faces get longer and longer. And in fact, we're going to need one because otherwise we're not going to be able to connect this properly. So let's add one in here and see if we can't go about filling this in. You actually may need two. So when you're doing a loop cut with the Control R function here, if you scroll up on the mouse wheel, you can increase the number of divisions and down will decrease it in your preview. So I just scrolled up once to create two so that I can now fill these in. Let's see, we need to create maybe one here. And we're probably going to end up with a triangle here, but as far as topology goes, this is one of the better areas to have a triangle, is somewhere in the cheek here. I actually think I'm going to slide this over and divide this one more time because it's not really curving nicely the way I want it to anyway, so this is probably going to solve our problems here. Because now we can connect maybe one like this. And we do have sort of a funny shaped face here, but we can sort of scoot these out so it's a little bit more easily recognizable as a quad and fill that in like that. Okay, so now if you ever want to check your edge loops, the Control-R is a great way to check that flow too. I mean, you can definitely come into like face select mode and hold Alt and select edge loops to view how the loops are being formed in your model. But you can also do this with Control-R and just checking where the preview goes, because this will always detect and run along your edge loops as well. Okay, let's see if we can't finish this with this face area with a grid fill. Now grid fill can be a little bit finicky. It takes a little bit of trial and error, I find. And depending on your selection, these options down here may or may not be functional. So we do have an uneven number of points here. Let's see how we can fix this so that we get a nice clean grid. I think maybe one more loop right here should help. Okay, I'm not satisfied with that result, so I'm going to probably just do this manually, or at least divide these up into smaller patches to use the grid fill with. So if I wanted to grid fill like this area, 1, 2, 3, 4. I believe as long as I match these, it should work, although I do find that the algorithm is somewhat sensitive. Yeah, I'm having some difficulty, so I'm just going to fill these by hand because I don't think it's worth spending that much time on something that's supposed to be saving me time, but doesn't always work. But since I was trying to get the grid to work, so I was carefully measuring out how many points I had going across, so this should fill in pretty quickly. So that's the result I was trying to get with the grid fill, but unfortunately, the algorithm doesn't always understand what you're trying to do. I'm just noticing some stretching here, so I'm gonna shift one of these edges over and split it to make these faces a little bit more even. And we're also getting some stretching along here, so I can select between these 2 points with holding the control, holding control, and then selecting this point will select everything between them. Now I can double tap G to sort of just shift them over along their edge loops. There we go. I also find I have issues with the grid fill when I'm working close to the line of symmetry. If I'm working on a patch over here it tends to work a little better. I think the having the mirror modifier here can sort of confuse it at times. So I'm just going to select all of these and extrude them down because I have this little divot for the lip and I want to make sure that I get that into my topology here. Okay, so this is a great area where I would form a diamond. So let's extrude this point out and start filling this in. So now I can come over here and fill in a row like this. Oops. Not selecting the faces in the back. And I just connect these. I'm just going to connect these together, and then I'm going to use my loop cuts to get that roundness in there. And because I have all the snapping and shrink wrapping turned on, it'll just automatically conform when I add the cuts. I think this can be probably a diamond right here because we need to start reducing our topology down here. And maybe get rid of this one. Actually, that one I think is necessary to get this curvature, so I'm going to leave it in. And I'm probably going to undo this one and do it a different way. Okay, let's see if we can't fill this little patch in before we wrap this video up. I think I am going to need some more points here. Maybe one. And maybe one right here. And let's try to just fill this in really quick. I think this is a good candidate for creating a triangle right here, so I'm just going to merge these 2 points together at their center. Yeah, this is looking pretty good. So I was just thinking about how I wanted to cover these nostril areas, and although they don't really deform, so having a proper edge loop going around them is not quite as important as it is for areas of deformation. I do want to get a loop around them because I feel like it's going to give us a better subdivision when we go into our high poly sculpting. So I'm just going to do this the same way that I've done with the other loops I've created. I'm just going to match this point to this point, and I'm going to extrude out a rough loop around the perimeter here. Actually, that should probably be 1 point. And then I'm gonna Alt and click to select the entire thing. And now I can hit E and S and scale this so that it fits the nostril a little bit better. However, I should probably think about the number of points I have around here. So I have 7 right now, which is an odd number, so this isn't going to split nicely into quads when I get to the center. So I'm just going to add 1 more cut around this edge of this loop. I just need to shift some things around so I can get a good place to put it. Probably right here. Because this point will match to this matches to this will match to that, there. So I need some more points over here. So now I have 8 points going around, and this will divide into quads a little bit more easily. So let's go E and S one more time. And of course, at this small scale, we are going to have some issues with snapping. So we're just going to have to come in and probably manually adjust these. Okay, so let's fill this one in here, 2, 3, perfect. Now I can fill this face here, adjust this one slightly, fill this one in here. And I think here I'm going to have to create another triangle. That's okay. Okay, so this more or less concludes the face retopology. We've gotten the face completely covered in a relatively short amount of time. So I'm going to pause the recording right here, and when we come back, we will finish up our retopology. Okay, so let's continue pushing forward with the retopology. We got probably the most difficult part out of the way, which is the face. We still have a little bit of difficulty getting the ears, mostly just joining them to the face. So let's just dive in. So I'm going to tab into edit mode on my retopology piece, and noticing some stretching right away. So let's just come in and shift these over so they're slightly more even. And up here as well, maybe shift these up a little bit. Okay, so I want to create a loop of edges coming around this way. So I'm just going to select a single point, Shift D. We'll start it about there, and let's extrude this out. Okay, rotate around. So I'm thinking that this is going to match nicely here, and this here. You can just start shifting things around. Okay. So that is not bad. Before I start getting into the weeds of connecting this, I'm just going to hit E and S to start scaling this in to fill in this loop here. See, 16, so So this is a good example of how to use the grid fill away from the line of symmetry here. This works much more cleanly. I'm going to create a diamond right here because I know I'm going to need to basically split this loop here. And now what I can try to do is come around the edge of this here. And as long as my snapping doesn't complain too much about this, I'm just going to try to extrude this straight back around the ear. Of course I have snapping issues, but we could fix that by hand. And if this is getting a little too difficult to parse, you can always turn off your mirror modifier or turn off the in front view. This will help you to stop seeing the back sides of the mesh poking through, but of course now we're having an issue seeing the pieces that we need to see. So the other option here is to, this is just for the purposes of visualization. This is not going to be incorporated or applied as our final result, but we can add a displacement modifier to our retopology here. It's under the deform panel, displace. So we need to enable visualization in edit mode for this to work with our retopology, but you can see it's pushing our plane away from the face of this. Now the underlying mesh is still snapping based on our shrink wrap modifier, but this is just so that we can see what is happening. We can push it away temporarily, and if we need to reduce the strength of this, we can. Let's set that back to 0.5. So it's up to you, whatever works. I tend to use sort of a combination depending on what area of the mesh I'm currently working on. And of course we can draw it on the cage here so that we can actually see what we're doing. So this is just helping me see what's going on with the ear without having to see the back faces of this. I have a point that is not in the right area. Yeah, so I have one of these points is snapping through my mesh. So I just went into wireframe to sort of sort out where it went. Let's just delete this point altogether because it's causing problems. And this one is also snapping through in a weird way, I think. Yeah. This point right here is snapping through to the inside of my mesh. So the only bad thing about the displacement modifier is it's a little bit harder to tell if you're getting your forms correct, but you can always toggle it on and off to try to visualize what's going on here. Okay, let's see if we can't at least finish up the head here. I am gonna need an edge, I think, splitting these two. So let me undo that really quick and just extrude this point out. We need another one right there. And then we just need to kind of shift these around so they're more even. think a triangle right here is fine. It's sort of up by the ear, sort of tucked away. So I'm just gonna fill this face with a single one, and then I'm gonna cut in to get that roundness to it. I think I actually need 4 cuts instead of 3 though, so let me undo that and redo it. Yeah, it looks a little bit better. So I have 13 cuts going all the way around, so I'm just gonna add one more to make it an even number. And we're gonna try the grid fill. The grid fill doesn't work as well with these sort of triangular patches, but it can sometimes. So let me just try it. I have a feeling it's not going to work in this patch because of the shape of it, but we can still try. I also think I don't have enough cuts going along this way because I'm getting a lot of mesh poke through. It's okay if it pokes through a little bit. In fact, it probably should because it needs to occupy the same space in our scene, but if you have large portions of your sculpt poking through, I mean, we've seen in our previous videos how that can cause issues for baking. So it's not going to work for this patch because it's more triangular, unfortunately, so we're just going to have to do it by hand. And so that was what I was trying to achieve. There we go. And then I turned the mirror modifier's visibility off just so I could see what I was doing a little bit more clearly. So I'm going to turn it back on just to check my line of symmetry here, and you can see there's areas where it did not clip to the center properly. So I'm just going to hold Alt and click on it to highlight this edge lip right here, which should highlight everything around the line of symmetry. And press G and X, and I'm going to bring everything in until it clips. I'm going to do it one more time in the opposite direction. Actually, when you're doing this with a shrink wrap modifier on, sometimes you can get some snapping errors, so it's maybe best to do it on a smaller section at a time. GX and bring it in, just until everything is snapped properly and clipped together. Okay. So that looks pretty good. Let's continue on with this head here. It's really the areas where you connect like large patches to like the face and things like that. That's where I find I have the most difficulty personally. I'm just going to make sure that this is all clipped together, because I'm seeing some errors right here. It looks like it's merging over the line of symmetry here, so I just want to make sure that it's not doing that. Okay. Let's bring one quad in here. I think a triangle right here would be appropriate. So I ended up with some strangeness right here. So let's talk about how to fix something like this. I have this like crazy polygon here with many sides, and I'm not even quite sure how I did that. But to split a face into multiple faces, you cannot use the fill key, because that is to fill gaps that are holes in your mesh. So to split an existing face, all you have to do is press J on your keyboard with 2 points selected, and it will cut a line across the face to connect those two, and now I have two separate faces here. So I can do the same thing going up, select this face and hit J, and it even draws the point in the center for me there. Going to merge these two because I think that they're close enough together that that won't be an issue. I do need to create a diamond right here. So I'm going to come down from the line of symmetry again and just start filling in some of these quads here to get some coverage in the back. I'm just making sure that these ones and these ones line up properly. Okay. Yeah, I'm having a lot of issues with this grid fill. Maybe it's because I'm trying to select around the corners. Yeah. So if you select on these straight edges, you're gonna get a better result than if you try to select on the corners. Okay, so for this ear here, we need to make sure that we have an edge running into this crease so that we maintain the form of it. So I'm just gonna use the F2 add-on to create these quads and just make sure that I'm nestling these points that I'm making into the crease here. So this is going to be sort of a diamond. It's kind of a strange shaped one, but it is important that I go from a higher res area to a lower res area, and the best way to do that is, of course, with a diamond. And I'm probably going to need another one right here, so that this one can be a quad. And then that way we're tucking sort of these funny shaped polygons behind the ears in an area where they will be less visible. Same thing here. Let's make this one into a diamond. Actually, I don't think that's going to work right there. We need to pull this one out to have a quad because this edge needs to extend downwards. This will be our diamond right here. I mean, as you can probably imagine, the greater the density in one area and the lower the density in the other. So what I mean to say is the greater the contrast between high density areas and low density areas, the more of these sort of funny shapes, triangles, and diamonds you're going to have to use. And that's just unfortunately the nature of working in Retopology. So we're at about 30 minutes. I'm going to wrap up this video here. We've completed most of the head. So Retopology is just more of the same. However, I do want to come back in one more video and talk about how to really efficiently retopologize long cylindrical forms such as arms, fingers, and legs. So that will be when we come back in the next video. I want to make this go as quickly as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm scaling this in the X just to get this a little bit more even. And what I can do now is I can extrude down. And now keep in mind all my snapping is turned off, so I have to be a little bit more careful about my placement and my scale and things, but we can go all the way down the length of the arm and roughly match it here. And then we can come in with our snapping turned back on to get this to snap to the surface of your mesh here. So we just want to create sort of an envelope here. Now, the other thing that is good to note about the arms and legs is that you can sort of reinforce the elbows. So We talked a lot about facial deformation, but we haven't talked a lot about body deformation, and this is actually more important for our purposes because we are not going to be animating the face, but we are going to be animating the limbs. So we want to make sure that we get good edge loops around all the areas that are going to be deformed, meaning the shoulders, the elbows, the wrists, and any points of articulation where we have joints. So I think we drew in our elbows about here. And if you're ever confused, this is why it's good to put a bend, a slight bend in your model when you're creating the model for it, because you can always tell where your elbows are supposed to be. So it looks like my elbows are supposed to be about there based on the form of my model, maybe a little bit up here. So to reinforce this area and make sure that it gets good bending around it, I'm gonna add what are called some like reinforcement loops on each side of it. So I'm just gonna hit Control R and bring these in really tight. Now, of course, these quads aren't even to each other, but because this is an area that needs to bend more, we just need more geometry here in order to get that bend to really look good and smooth when we come in to do our animations. So it's always good to add a couple extra edge loops around elbows, wrists, and shoulders, any points where you have joints that are going to bend. So let's turn our shrink wrap back on. I'm going to drag it to the top of the modifier stack, and I'm going to set my character object. And now you can see that even though I extruded out this entire arm without the shrink wrap on it, because I was getting so many snapping errors, even though I added it back afterwards, it just snapped to the nearest surface and everything looks pretty good here. We can even turn off our displacement to see the final result. And we can always hide our character sculpt in the viewport to see if there's any errors, any weird points where the vertices are snapping to the wrong side or anything like that. So I'm basically going to do that for the arms and for the legs, and then we'll just connect everything together. So I'm going to disable my shrink wrap once again and basically just do the same thing. I'm going to get a point here, put it on the leg. Actually, for creating the loop around, I should probably keep the shrink wrap on. And then I will turn it off when I go to extrude downwards. I'm gonna extrude up and around, and just around the base of this leg here. Okay, so now I can turn it off. And in fact, I don't even really need to delete it from my mesh entirely. What I really needed to do was so here we have our shrink wrap. I can just disable this by clearing out this target field, and then you don't have to keep adding it to the modifier stack. So doing this, we'll just disable it. Of course, anything that was not placed accurately is going to snap back to where it was, but you should get a rough idea of where these pieces need to go. I'm going to keep them fairly tight into the mesh, even though we will be adding our shrink wrap modifier back. In order to get them to snap correctly, you want them to be close to the surface that you want to snap them to. Okay. Let's go into orthographic view. And I'm going to scale these in the Z direction to get them relatively flat. And we may need to even shift this entire edge loop over a bit Okay, let's keep going down and roughly try to match the shape of the legs here. So here's our point where our knee is. So I'm going to come down one more, and then before I even move on, I'm just going to add my reinforcement loops around the knee. And make sure that you are matching this not only in the front view, but in the side views as well. Otherwise, your shrink wrap will not snap correctly, and you will end up with a lot of cleanup, which I'm sure we will end up with some cleanup anyway, but we're trying to reduce the amount of time we spend doing things like that. Okay, so let's turn our shrink wrap back on and see how this has done with our snapping. It looks pretty good. I am noticing some asymmetry here, and I think that is caused by our origin point not being perfectly symmetrical. So to set the line of symmetry back to the center of the world, I'm gonna hit Shift and C to move my 3D cursor back to the origin of the world here. And then I'm going to, in object mode, right click on my retopology, and I'm going to choose set origin, origin to 3D cursor. And now you can see that the left half has snapped ever so slightly over because the origin wasn't perfectly lined up for this piece. So now that we have fixed that, we may have some issues right here. Basically, it has snapped too far over. So what I would do to fix something like this is actually just merge all these points together. So we're going to do a merge by distance operation on this. So I'm going to hit M on my keyboard and choose by distance. Now nothing will happen at first because our distance is set too low. So we just have to play around with this value here until we get something that merges these center ones together without causing any other issues. And okay, so I've set it to 0.1 and it's really only merged a couple of these. So let's just do this by hand. Oops, too far. So we still have our clipping turned on, so if we grab this edge loop and just slide it around in the X direction with G and X, we should be able to merge all those points. Okay, so we're getting some errors caused by our shrink wrap modifier itself, so I'm gonna just try to drag the mirror modifier above it, and that should snap all these points to their proper location. Okay, so the neck and the fingers and the toes are all gonna pretty much be using this cylindrical extrusion method for retopology. So let's look at that here. I'm going to add a couple more reinforcement loops to the wrist here. And let's create a loop for the neck. So I'm just going to press Shift D and duplicate this edge here and bring it to the center until it clips. I do need to either need to turn clipping off and extrude away, or I can Control Z to undo that and actually bring them slightly off center and then extrude them inwards to create that center line. You probably need another loop in there. Okay, Okay, so I'm going to select this top loop with alt clicking, and I'm just going to extrude the entire thing up a couple times to get the majority of the neck covered. And from here, we can just start connecting the head to the neck. And I'm going to add a couple cuts in here to get the form of that. So I'm just troubleshooting some of these center points here. Because I want this low poly mesh to be symmetrical, if I do the mirror modifier first, it does like fix some of these issues, but it will mirror this and then shrink it to the surface. And the end result of that will be a slightly asymmetrical mesh. And I don't really want that. I want them to be symmetrical. So I do want the shrink wrap up here. And the only issue with that is some of these areas in the center here are a little bit off. But I found that if you just kind of move them slightly to the point where they snap, then you can move them more or less freely. You can't move them to an extreme amount, but you can move them more or less freely, and they should stay together. So I can move it up a little bit till it snaps and then back down to its original position, and it will be clipped at a single point here. So it takes a little bit longer, but I think the end result will be worth it. Okay. So the rest of this process is more or less going to be the same as everything I have been doing up to this point. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and we will come back in the next video. We'll take a look at some of the areas that I want to pay attention to and highlight, but then we will be done with our retopology, and we will be ready to bring this back into sculpt mode for our high-res sculpt portion. All right, so I have finished the main section of the retopology of the body off camera here. So right now, what I really want to address is doing a little bit of cleanup work. As I was looking at this model, I noticed that there were some errors, and rather than just fix them off camera, I thought I would show you how to do a little bit of cleanup work so that if your own model requires cleanup, you would know how to go about that. So the first thing I'm going to do is just delete my displacement modifier. That was just for the purposes of visualization, and we don't actually want to apply it to our model. So the next thing that I noticed was that if I shaded it smooth, we could start to see some of these like weird pinching along the center line here. And that is caused by our mirror modifier not clipping correctly to the center. So we're going to fix that in a minute. But before we get rid of our mirror modifier, there's just a couple of areas that have sort of some funny topology that, because I was editing other portions and adding edge loops, we're going to get some weird areas of pinching, especially right here around this mouth. You'll see where all this sort of dense topology is right in the corner. Now, because we have denser topology here than we do over the rest of the face, when we subdivide this, it's going to pinch strangely, and we can preview this with a subdivision surface modifier. So let's just go add one in here. And if we upres this a little bit, like to viewport level 2 or so, we can see that there's some pinching happening here. So we need to sort of redistribute our polygons or get rid of certain edge loops in order to fix that. So let's address this first, because once we apply the mirror modifier, we will then have to go edit both sides by hand, which we don't want to do. So if we address this area first, we should save ourselves a little bit of work. So right here, I think I added an edge loop around the ear to add a little bit of roundness around the ear, but because of the formation of my edge loops, it ended up coming all the way around to the mouth, which I do not want. So what I'm going to do to fix this, first, I'm going to hit the on-cage visualizer on the subdivision surface just so I can see all the points. And it does cause this bowing effect because there's a subdivision surface happening underneath it, but it allows me to just see all my points rendered directly on the mesh, whereas here sometimes we have the mesh because it's being subdivided and smooth clipping through. So I just need to be able to access all these points. So I think I'm going to go from here and I'm going to come all the way into the center line along this loop. So I'm going to hold Control to just pick the shortest path. Now I'm not using the Alt key because I don't actually want the entire edge loop. I want to maintain this one around here, but this area is going to cause some strange pinching, so I want to dissolve this edge loop. So the way that I'm going to do that is by hitting X on my keyboard, and down at the bottom here I'm going to select edge loops. So that has created some triangles here, but I pushed the triangle sort of out towards the side of the head where they will not affect our animation too much. We also probably need to get rid of one of these up here. We have some strange topology. Probably this center one is what's causing our issue going through the eye. Yes, the same thing. I added this loop to get some better form for the eye, but it ended up coming all the way around down the mouth. So the same thing here. I want to dissolve part of this loop and push any triangles that deleting this will form. I'm going to push them out over here where it won't affect our animation too poorly. So I'm just going to click the center point here, and then I'm going to follow this edge loop and just hold Control and click until I get to about here. I think that won't cause too many problems. So let's dissolve this here. And you can see that the edges it's forming, often it'll end in a triangle here. And you can come up here and manually clean these up so that they're not quite as, there's not quite as many triangles, I should say. So we could do some work in merging these. But for our purposes, I think this is going to be relatively okay here. It's a little bit messy over here, but it's okay. If you have to have triangles, you definitely want to push them out away from areas that are going to be deformed by our animation. Okay. So we've gotten rid of some of this pinching here. Some of this can be caused by redistributing, or some of these can be solved, I should say, by redistributing some of these faces. It's because these points are so close together that we're getting this pinching when we subdivide, because this area then becomes more divided than areas around it. So let's try to use a smooth operator here. So all I've done here is I've highlighted this section, and I've chosen from the side toolbar here this smooth thing, which will give you this handle, this yellow handle here. And if you click on and drag on it, it will try to average out the location of all these points. I'm just gonna try to slide these around so that they're a little bit less pinched. It's sort of a balancing game because you do want this crease to be nice and tight for the mouth, but you don't want to cause like any unnatural looking pinching. Okay, I think that looks a little bit better. And there's also some pinching happening here in this hip area where we have a lot of density. So same thing here. I think I added this loop to get some more definition for the fingers, but because of the flow of my edges, it added it all the way down the side of the leg. And it's not really causing too many problems. It's just really in this area here. So I think I'm just going to try to smooth this area out. So if I hit C on my keyboard, I'll get this sort of selection brush, which I can scale up and down with the mouse wheel. But if I come and just click, I can sort of click and paint a selection directly on my, my mesh here. So let's just try to smooth this one out a little bit too. Something more like that. So I'm not seeing any dramatic pinching here when I have the subdivision surface applied. So I think we're good there. Okay, I don't actually want to use a subdivision surface modifier on this. I'm going to use a multi-res. So I can go ahead and delete this. And the reason I'm deleting this is because I want to now apply all these modifiers so that we can come in and clean up these center line issues we're having that are being caused by this mirror modifier. So the way I'm going to do that is just to apply these and come in and clean them up by hand. So I'm going to apply these by, in object mode, right-clicking on my object and selecting Convert to Mesh. Everything is gone, and if we press Tab to come into edit mode, you'll see that we have our complete mesh here. So once again, these are easier to see when you have this subdivided a few times. So the subdivision surface or the multi-res modifier would work for basically just we're looking for errors in our mesh right now. So I'm going to come in here and fix these center line issues. And when you see pinching like this along your line of symmetry, it's caused by the mirror modifier not clipping these together properly. So you can see that there's a little bit of overlap here. And if I move this around, there's actually a hole in our mesh, which we do not want. So let's come in here and just merge these together by selecting them, M at center. And we have some more issues down here along the center line. Which we may need to come into wireframe to fix some of these. Looks like these are not merged together properly. And right here, we're getting the same thing. I can tell this is not merged properly because of the way that it is reflecting light. When something is connected, it will reflect light a little bit differently than this. So they're very close together, but here you can see that there is in fact 2 points there. So let's merge them. And if you're ever not sure if your points are merged properly, you can always come in to the area that you're having an issue with, say like, oh, there's some strange shading here. If you just click on one of them and move them around, you'll be able to see really easily that there is in fact a hole in your mesh. I believe there's also one down here. Yes, there is. Another good way to check for your edge flow is just to alt-click on your line of symmetry, and if it does not select it completely all the way around, you know that there is an issue with your mesh. Okay, so I'm just really carefully tabbing in and out of edit mode to try to see any areas where there's strange pinching or any areas of errors along that center line specifically. Okay, let me hide the eyes for a minute and check in here. Make sure that you close up your eye holes as well. Sculpting with the eyes on, or I should say retopologizing with the eyes on, sometimes you can forget to retopologize behind the eyes, but since the eyes are going to be a separate object that we're not going to be sculpting on, this entire mesh needs to be a completely closed form, so there can't be any holes or like hanging wire edges on it for it to work properly in the sculpt. Take a look at the hands. The hands were a bit tricky to retopologize, mostly in just these crevices here. So I am going to be including this model in the supplementary materials so you can see how the retopology was done in certain areas up close, so you can just take a look at it yourself. Okay, so I think that is going to conclude our character cleanup work, or our low poly cleanup work. So we're going to pause the recording right here, and when we come back, we're going to start actually doing our high res sculpting.